my partner isn't human anymore. You have all read the official report, the one that closed the case on Officer Maya Singh and put her name on the memorial wall. That report, which I signed, is a procedural necessity, a lie constructed to maintain public order. The truth is that my partner wasn't killed by a suspect at the Blackwood Reservoir. She was compromised by something that wore her uniform, and my duty required me to be the one to end her watch. The air in conference room 3B was chilled and recycled, carrying the faint, sterile scent of industrial carpet cleaner. Officer Kenji Tanaka sat at the long mahogany table, his back ramrod straight, his dress uniform feeling a size too small across the shoulders. A single bead of sweat traced a path down his temple, but he did not move to wipe it away. Across from him sat the Internal Affairs Review Board Deputy Chief Marcus Thorne, his face a mask of practiced neutrality. Captain Eva Rostova from his own precinct, who avoided his gaze and studied a pen on the table, and a union representative named Miller whose sole purpose seemed to be to glower. The microphone in the center of the table was a small black cylinder, an unblinking eye for the digital recorder humming softly beside it. Tanaka placed his hands flat on the table, lacing his fingers together to still their tremor. He had rehearsed this moment, run through the permutations, and calculated the cost. His career, his pension, quite possibly his freedom, all of it was stacked like chips on this table, wagered against a truth that had no place in a police report. He drew a slow, measured breath, the kind they teach you at the academy to steady your rein before a qualification shoot. He looked directly at Deputy Chief Thorne, meeting the man as flat, assessing stare. "Sirs, he began, his voice steady, betraying none of the chaos churning within him. "I am Officer Kenji Tanaka, Shield number 714. This is a supplementary, off-the-record statement regarding the investigation into the death of my partner, Officer Maya Singh, Shield number 802. He paused, letting the formal weight of the words settle in the quiet room. Captain Rostova finally looked up, her expression unreadable. Miller shifted in his seat, the leather creaking in protest. "You have my official report, Incident File 77B91, Tanaka continued, his tone unwavering, as if reading from a teleprompter only he could see. "That document is a work of fiction. It is a necessary fabrication, constructed in accordance with departmental directives to maintain public order and prevent a panic for which we have no protocol." He saw Thorne's jaw tighten infinitesimally, the only sign the deputy chief was even breathing. "The report states that Officer Singh was killed in the line of duty during a confrontation with an unidentified and armed suspect at the Blackwood Reservoir pumping station. That is not what happened." Another silence descended, heavier this time. Tanaka felt the finality of his words, the point of no return. The bridge was burned. He had stepped outside the blue line, outside the procedural safety of the system he had sworn to uphold. But his duty was not just to the system, and was to the truth of what had happened to Maya, and to protecting everyone else from ever having to face what she became. "My partner is dead," he said, the words tasting like ash. "But she was not killed by a person. My official report is incomplete because the regulations have no designation for the entity that compromised her, and my duty required me to be the one to end her watch. This testimony is the full, unredacted account of those events." It began, as these things so often do, with a call that defied categorization. The digital screen of the squad car's terminal read disturbance. UNK Nature. RP Anonymous. The location was tagged at the old Blackwood Reservoir pumping station, a place that hadn't seen a city maintenance crew in 20 years. It was the kind of call that usually ended in ticketing a few teenagers for trespassing or clearing out a homeless encampment. A routine waste of time on a slow Tuesday night. Officer Maya Singh was driving, her hands resting lightly on the wheel, her profile illuminated by the green glow of the dashboard. She had a placid efficiency about her that Tanaka had always found reassuring. They drove in a comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackle of the radio and the crunch of gravel as they turned onto the unpaved access road leading to the reservoir. The station loomed out of the darkness, a concrete monolith stained with rust and graffiti, its windows long since shattered. They cleared the perimeter first, standard procedure. Flashlight beams cut sharp cones through the humid night air, revealing little more than weeds and shattered glass. No signs of forced entry, no footprints in the damp soil near the entrance. The main door was sealed with a thick, rusted chain, but another, smaller maintenance hatch hung ajar, its metal groaning softly in the breeze. "I'll take point," Singh said, her voice low and even as she unholstered her sidearm. Tanaka nodded, falling into position behind her, his own weapon held in a low ready stance. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of decayed stagnant water, mildew, and the metallic tang of corrosion. Their lights played over defunct machinery, massive turbines and control panels that were monuments to a forgotten era of civic engineering. They swept the main floor, room by room, finding nothing. No suspects, no squatters, no evidence of any recent activity. "Dispatch, 7 Adam 14, Tanaka spoke into his shoulder mic. Location appears secure. Code 4. Well, do one more sweep of the lower level in clear." The lower level was a single, cavernous chamber housing the primary intake pumps. It was here they found it. In the exact center of the room, suspended about 3 feet off the grated metal floor, was an object that had no business existing. It wasn't emitting light, yet it seemed to absorb their flashlight beams, making the space around it feel darker. It was a shifting lattice of obsidian lines and impossible angles, a 3-dimensional shape that his eyes couldn't properly resolve. Looking at it was like trying to remember a dream. The details slipped away, leaving behind a residue of cognitive dissonance and a low-grade headache. A faint, sub-audible hum emanated from it, a vibration felt more in the teeth and bones than heard with the ears. Tanaka instinctively took a step back. "Central, be advised, we have an unidentified object. Requesting a supervisor." Singh, however, took a step forward. Her firearm was still raised, but her focus was absolute, her expression one of intense, analytical curiosity. "What is that?" she breathed, her voice tight with fascination. "Singh, hold your position," Tanaka ordered, his own voice strained. "That's an order. We wait for backup." She didn't seem to hear him. She lowered her weapon, holstering it with a smooth, practiced motion, and continued to walk toward the thing. The humming intensified, and the geometric patterns of the object seemed to fold in on themselves, twisting in ways that violated the basic laws of physics. "Maya, damn it, get back here." She was only a few feet from it now. She raised her hand, her fingers outstretched as if to touch a museum piece. The air around the object shimmered, distorting the view of the far wall like heat haze off asphalt. Tanaka started to move, to physically pull her back, but it was too late. Her fingertips made contact with one of the impossible, razor-sharp edges. There was no sound, no explosion of energy. For a single, silent moment, the object flared with an internal, violet light, etching a complex, circuit-like pattern onto Tanaka's retinas. He saw the same pattern flash behind Singh's eyes. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the object and the vibration were gone. The room was just a room again, dark, damp, and empty. Singh stood perfectly still for a second before blinking slowly, lowering her hand. She looked at her fingers, then back at the empty space where the object had been. "Did you see that?" she asked, her tone strangely calm, almost dismissive. "Yeah, I saw it," Tanaka said, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Are you okay? Did you feel anything?" She shook her head, a small, dismissive gesture. "Nothing. Just a little static shock." She turned to him, her professional mask already slipping back into place. "Probably some kind of high-tech projection. Pranksters. Or maybe a gas leak from the old pipes causing some kind of atmospheric anomaly." He knew it was more than that. He knew it in the same primal part of his brain that recognized the shape of a predator in the dark. But there was no protocol for this. There was no box to check on an incident report for an object that defied geometry. And so, when they filed their report an hour later, they checked the box for suspicious circumstance, and in the narrative, they described the possible exposure to an unknown airborne hallucinogen from improperly disposed industrial waste. It was the first official lie, a clean, procedural explanation for a fundamentally unclean event. The first noticeable change in Officer Singh's professional conduct occurred 12 days after the Blackwood Reservoir call. For nearly 2 weeks, the incident had been a silent passenger in their patrol car, an unspoken, unresolved variable. They had both been cleared by psych services after a mandatory 48-hour administrative leave, the official narrative of hallucinogenic gas accepted without question. It was easier for everyone, Tanaka included, to file the experience under unexplained and move on. He had almost convinced himself it was nothing more than a trick of the light, a shared delusion brought on by bad air in a confined space. Then came the domestic dispute on Elm Street. The call was a standard-issue powder keg, a man, high on something cheap and potent, holding his terrified girlfriend in their cramped apartment kitchen. He had a knife. When they arrived, the man was screaming, his words a slurry of paranoia and rage. Tanaka was positioning himself to get a clean line of sight for his taser when Singh did something that was not in any training manual. She stepped past him, placing herself directly in the man's line of sight, her own weapon holstered. Singh, tactical retreat, now. Tanaka hissed into his mic, his blood running cold. She ignored him. She looked at the man, not with pity or authority, but with a kind of detached, diagnostic focus. The man raised the knife, his knuckles white. Singh didn't raise her voice. She didn't plead. She simply said, in a calm, conversational tone, "You forgot to lock the back door this morning." The man froze. His tirade died in his throat. His eyes, which had been wide with frantic energy, narrowed in utter confusion. He glanced over his shoulder, as if expecting to see the door in question. The entire psychotic momentum of the confrontation shattered. In that moment of disorientation, Tanaka moved, deploying the taser. The man went down, the knife clattering harmlessly to the floor. Later, in the car, Tanaka had demanded an explanation. "What the hell was that, Maya?" "That was a break in protocol. He could have killed you." It was a cognitive interrupt, she had replied smoothly, her eyes on the road. "I read a monograph on it." Disrupt their emotional feedback loop with an unexpected, concrete piece of information. It forces a context shift in the brain. It worked, didn't it? Her logic was sound, if reckless. And she was right. It had worked. He logged the incident as a successful, if unorthodox, de-escalation. 2 weeks later, the second shift occurred. They were in interrogation room 2 with a suspect in a series of armed robberies, a man named Dmitry Volkov who had been stonewalling them for hours. Volkov spoke only Russian, and the department's on-call translator was stuck in traffic. Frustrated, Tanaka was about to call it a night when Singh, who had been sitting silently in the corner, leaned forward. She spoke a single sentence in fluent, unaccented Russian. Tanaka didn't understand the words, but he understood the effect. Volkov, who had been slouching with defiant boredom, snapped upright in his chair. His face went pale. He began to stammer, first in denial, then in a torrent of panicked confession, a full and detailed account of every robbery he had committed. After they had Mirandized him again with the now-arrived translator and secured his written statement, Tanaka cornered Singh in the hallway. "I didn't know you spoke Russian." "I don't," she said, her expression unreadable as she initialed the evidence log. "What?" "Maya, I heard you. You spoke to him." "I've been listening to language tutorials online. Picked up a few phrases," she said with a shrug. "I just repeated one I thought was relevant." Lucky guess. It was a flimsy, ridiculous explanation. He knew for a fact that Maya's family was from Punjab, and she spoke only English. But the case was closed. The string of robberies that had terrorized the West Side for months was solved. Captain Rostova gave them both a commendation. In the face of such a resounding success, Tanaka found his objections felt petty, even obstructionist. He told himself he was overthinking things, that his partner had simply developed a new, highly effective, and deeply eccentric set of skills. The precinct was a hollowed-out shell of itself after midnight. The daytime clamor of ringing phones, shouting detectives, and crying victims was replaced by a low, electrical hum from the overhead fluorescent lights. It was in this quiet that Officer Tanaka found himself doing the least glamorous part of the job paperwork. He was in the records annex adjacent to the evidence room, catching up on a backlog of chain of custody forms. The coffee in his mug was cold and bitter, but it was a familiar anchor in the long, silent hours. He needed to cross-reference a detail from the Volkov interrogation. Pulling the file jacket, he opened it on the cluttered desk. Officer Singh had filed the primary report. He began to read, and a furrow formed on his brow. It wasn't that the report was good, it was flawless. Police reports are, by nature, messy documents. They are patchworks of witness statements, officer observations, and forensic data, often filled with contradictions, dead ends, and unanswered questions. They reflect the chaotic reality of a crime. Singh's report did not. It was a perfect, linear narrative. Every statement logically supported the next. Every piece of evidence fit neatly into the timeline. There were no ambiguities. The suspect's motive, means, and opportunity were laid out with the clean, irrefutable precision of a mathematical proof. It read less like a report written in the aftermath of a confusing event and more like a script written beforehand. He pulled the file from the Elm Street domestic dispute. It was the same, a seamless, surgically clean account that excised all the friction and uncertainty of the actual event. It was the kind of police work that only existed in academy textbooks. A cold knot of unease tightened in his stomach. This wasn't just good police work, it was unnatural. He pushed the thought aside, attributing it to his own fatigue. Finishing his last form, he picked up the sealed evidence bag from a minor possession bust, a small glass pipe, and headed into the main evidence room. The room was a library of human misery, row after row of gray metal lockers filled with the tangible remnants of crimes. The air was cool and dry, smelling faintly of paper and plastic. He walked down aisle C, looking for the correct temporary locker, when he passed the section for long-term storage. A sudden, intense cold washed over him, so profound it was like stepping into a walk-in freezer. It wasn't a draft from the ventilation system, it was a pocket of still, biting cold that seemed to cling to his uniform and sap the warmth from his skin. He stopped, turning his head. The cold was emanating from a specific bank of lockers at the end of the aisle, the ones designated for evidence from unresolved, anomalous cases. Unofficially, the old-timers called it the X-locker. It was where you put things that couldn't be explained but also couldn't be thrown away, a strange, melted-looking rock from a supposed UFO sighting, a book written in an indecipherable language found at a ritualistic crime scene, and other such procedural detritus. As he stood there, another sensation registered. A sound, so faint it was on the very edge of hearing. It was a whisper, or rather, a multitude of whispers, layered one on top of the other, like dozens of hushed conversations happening in the next room. The sound was distorted, staticky, devoid of discernible words but possessing the unmistakable cadence of speech. He held his breath, straining to listen. The whispers seemed to coil in the cold air. He took a hesitant step closer to the lockers. The sound grew infinitesimally louder, the pace of the murmuring quickening as if in agitation. He took a step back, and it receded. It was reacting to him. A shiver, entirely unrelated to the cold, traced its way up his spine. He was a man who dealt with concrete threats, knives, guns, fists. This was something else, an intangible rawness that his training had never prepared him for. He quickly found the correct locker for his evidence, secured the bag, and left the room, pointedly not looking back at the cold, whispering corner. The heavy steel door swung shut behind him, but the feeling of being observed, and the memory of that layered, static susurrus, followed him out into the humming silence of the precinct. It started with the Henderson file, a cold case so frozen it was practically cryogenic. A home invasion gone wrong from 8 years prior, leaving a retired couple dead and the case file thick with useless leads and forensic dead ends. One afternoon, Officer Singh checked the file out from records. 48 hours later, she had a signed confession from a local handyman who had never even been a person of interest. The evidence she provided was irrefutable: the location of the murder weapon, a detail about the crime scene only the killer could have known, and a motive that tied everything together. It was a miracle of detective work. Then came the unsolved disappearance of a college student from 6 years back. Singh spent a single shift reviewing the evidence and cross-referencing it with city permits from that year. She led a dig team to a new construction site, and they found the body exactly where she said it would be, along with the man who put it there. Her closure rate, once merely respectable, became legendary within the department. Detectives who had spent years chasing ghosts now watched as she casually exorcised them over a weekend. She was hailed as a prodigy, a savant. Tanaka saw something else. He saw the same impossible perfection that he'd seen in her reports. The solutions were too neat, the confessions too clean. His unease, which had been a low hum in the back of his mind, was now a persistent, screaming alarm. His duty to his partner warred with his duty to the badge, and the badge was winning. One night, citing a need to review interview techniques for a rookie training seminar, he requested access to the department's digital video archive. He sequestered himself in a small, windowless viewing room, the air humming with the sound of server fans. He started with the Henderson case. The video showed Singh and the handyman, a man named Gerald Fleming, in interrogation room 3. Fleming was agitated, belligerent, denying everything. Singh was a picture of calm. She didn't use any of the standard techniques. No report building, no evidence bluffing, no good cop bad cop. She simply sat across from him, her hands folded on the table, and looked at him. She spoke in a low, even tone, her words inaudible on the tape's tinny audio. But Tanaka wasn't listening to her words, he was watching Fleming. The man's angry defiance slowly melted away. His posture slackened. His gaze became unfocused, distant, as if he were listening to something far away. And then, in a monotone voice utterly devoid of emotion, he began to confess, reciting the details of the murders with the dispassionate air of a man reading a grocery list. He seemed mesmerized, his will completely suborned. Tanaka fast-forwarded through hours of footage, watching tape after tape of Singh's recent interrogations. The pattern was always the same. Initial resistance from the suspect, a period of quiet conversation from Singh, and then a sudden, placid confession. The suspects weren't broken, they were reprogrammed. He finally landed on the video from the college student case. The suspect was a burly construction foreman, a man who had sneered his way through 2 prior interviews with other detectives. On the screen, Singh leaned forward, her face just outside the main camera's frame. Tanaka watched her reflection in the dark glass of the 2-way mirror behind the suspect. For a moment, it was just a normal, distorted image. But as she spoke her unheard words, the reflection changed. In the dark glass, her eyes were no longer brown. They were illuminated from within by a faint, violet light. It wasn't a trick of the light or a digital artifact. It was a steady, internal glow, and within it, he could just make out a shifting, incandescent pattern of impossible, interlocking lines, the same non-Euclidean geometry he had seen in the object at the Blackwood Reservoir. The thing hadn't just been an object. It had been a contagion. And it was now looking out at the world through his partner's eyes. The revelation in the viewing room changed everything. Tanaka no longer looked at Maya Singh as his partner, but as an unknown variable wearing her uniform. The easy camaraderie they once shared had evaporated, replaced by a tense, watchful silence on his part and an unnerving placidity on hers. She seemed not to notice his withdrawal, or if she did, she didn't care. Her focus was elsewhere, on a mission he was only beginning to comprehend. Her procedural deviations became more pronounced. She began disappearing during their shifts. It would start with a routine call, after which she'd claimed to be following a new lead, telling him to continue patrol and that she'd check in later. She would be unreachable on the radio for hours at a time, a cardinal sin in police work. Then she would reappear at the precinct just before end of watch, holding a single, perfect piece of evidence. A burner phone with a complete log of a drug trafficking ring's communications. A bloodstained knife, found in a dumpster miles from a crime scene, that matched a murder weapon. A ledger detailing an entire embezzlement scheme, discovered tucked away in a library book. Her official explanations for these discoveries were always plausible but vague. Conducted a tertiary canvass. Followed a hunch based on witness testimony. Re-examined the initial evidence logs. No one in the command staff questioned it. Why would they? Singh was a walking miracle, a one-woman wrecking crew dismantling the city's criminal element. Her solve rate single-handedly improved the department's public image and made the mayor's office ecstatic. To question her methods would be to question the results, and the results were spectacular. But Tanaka questioned. He knew there were no tertiary canvasses. He knew her hunches weren't hunches. This was information she shouldn't have been able to acquire through legitimate police work. It was as if she could see the hidden architecture of the city's crimes, the invisible lines connecting evidence to suspect. Her use of force also underwent a transformation. During a raid on a known gang hideout, they were met with heavy fire. Tanaka was pinned down behind the squad car, the air filled with the crack of gunshots and the whine of ricochets. Singh, however, moved with a terrifying economy of motion. She didn't seek cover so much as flow through the environment, her movements precise and calculated. She fired 3 shots from her service weapon. The first shattered the kneecap of a gunman taking aim at Tanaka. The second struck the trigger hand of another shooter as he leaned out a window. The third ricocheted off a steel girder at an impossible angle, striking a third suspect in the shoulder and causing him to drop his weapon. The engagement was over in seconds. On paper, it was a perfect application of justifiable, non-lethal force. Each shot was a textbook neutralization of a direct threat. But watching it happen was like watching a surgeon perform an operation with a sledgehammer. There was no hesitation, no adrenaline-fueled uncertainty. It was cold, mathematical, and utterly devoid of humanity. She hadn't been fighting for her life or she had been solving a tactical problem, and the men she shot were simply variables in an equation. He remembered the look on her face afterward, not relief, not fear, just a quiet, professional satisfaction. The same look a mechanic might have after successfully rebuilding an engine. The woman who had once bought him a coffee when he was having a bad day, who had laughed at his terrible jokes, was gone. In her place was this thing. This efficient, relentless, and utterly alien instrument of order. And Tanaka, bound by his duty, had to decide if this new version of his partner was a better kind of cop, or a threat more profound than any criminal they had ever faced. The department's mandatory after-action reports for any discharge of a firearm were a bureaucratic nightmare, but Tanaka found a grim utility in them. It gave him a legitimate, procedural reason to obsess over the details of the raid, a cover for the investigation he was now running on his own partner. He sat in the same windowless video viewing room as before, the smell of warm plastic and stale coffee a familiar companion. On the main monitor, he had his body camera footage from the raid synced with the precinct's incident logged. He replayed the critical 30 seconds for the 10th time. The muzzle flashes from the hideout, the sound of incoming rounds snapping past his position, the frantic radio calls for backup. Then, Singh's movement. She appeared at the left edge of his camera's frame, moving with that unnerving, fluid grace. He watched her fire her 3 precise, disabling shots. It was just as he remembered, efficient, terrifying, and tactically perfect. He was about to log the timestamps and move on when he noticed it. For a single, almost imperceptible instant as Singh crossed directly in front of his camera's lens, the video feed stuttered. The image pixelated into a burst of green and purple digital noise, and the audio registered a sharp, static hiss, like a squelch of raw data. It lasted no longer than a single frame of video, a fractional hiccup in the digital stream. To anyone else, it would be a meaningless glitch, a momentary data corruption from the chaos of the firefight. But Tanaka had seen enough. He knew, with a certainty that settled like a block of ice in his gut, that this was no random error. He isolated the corrupted frame. It was a mess of digital artifacts, a meaningless jumble of colored blocks. Standard recovery software was useless, the data was too fragmented. But Tanaka had a cousin who worked in digital forensics, a man who owed him a significant favor. On his next day off, he transferred the single frame of data to a secure thumb drive and met his cousin in a coffee shop far from the precinct. He fed him a plausible story about trying to recover a key frame from a damaged security camera for an unofficial side case. The cousin, more interested in the technical challenge than the excuse, agreed to help. 3 days later, an encrypted email arrived in Tanaka's personal inbox. The subject line was simply weird. The body of the email was short. Couldn't fully restore the image, the base layer data is like nothing I've ever seen. It's not structured like normal video code. Ran a recursive algorithm to rebuild what I could. Let me know what you make of this. Attached was a single image file. Tanaka opened it, his breath catching in his throat. The image was a composite, a ghostly overlay. He could still see Officer Singh, her face set in that expression of intense concentration, her service weapon leveled. But superimposed over her, like a double exposure, was something else. It was a silhouette, tall and unnaturally thin, its limbs elongated and jointed at sharp, insect-like angles. It had no discernible features, just a stark, black, angular shape that seemed to be wearing Singh's form like an ill-fitting coat. The proportions were wrong, inhuman. The head was too small, the shoulders too broad, the entire figure radiating a sense of rigid, geometric structure. The corruption on the video feed hadn't been a glitch caused by the firefight. It was his camera sensor failing as it tried, for a single frame, to process what it was actually seeing. It was the digital equivalent of his own eyes failing to comprehend the object at the reservoir. He was looking at the true form of the thing that now partnered him on patrol. The entity that had looked out at him from the interrogation room mirror was not just inside her in some fundamental way, it was her. The image on his screen was the last piece of proof he needed. The line had been crossed from a partner acting strangely to a partner who was no longer human. The restored image from the body camera footage marked the end of deniability. Officer Tanaka could no longer operate under the pretense of observing a partner with unorthodox methods. He was now conducting surveillance on a potential unknown threat, a threat that happened to wear the same uniform he did. His duty to protect the public and his fellow officers demanded it. The thought of what that entity could do, with all the access and authority of a police officer, was a cold weight in his chest. He began his surveillance subtly. He used his personal vehicle, a nondescript gray sedan, parking it a block away from the precinct's rear lot. He waited. For the first 2 nights, Singh's routine was unremarkable. She drove from the precinct directly to her apartment building, took the elevator up, and a light in a 4th-floor window would switch on. Nothing out of the ordinary. Tanaka began to wonder if he was chasing shadows, if the stress of the job was finally making him see patterns that weren't there. On the 3rd night, the pattern broke. Singh exited the precinct, but instead of heading toward the parking lot, she started walking. Her pace was steady and purposeful. Tanaka let her get a block ahead before pulling out from his parking spot, killing his headlights and following at a crawl. He maintained a 2-block distance, using the flow of late-night traffic as cover. She didn't go to her apartment. She walked for nearly 2 miles, moving through the city's deserted streets with an unwavering sense of direction. Her route took her into the old judicial district, a neighborhood of grand, decaying buildings left behind when the city moved its administrative center a decade ago. She stopped in front of the old county courthouse, a massive, neoclassical structure with boarded-up windows and a crumbling portico. A chain-link fence, topped with concertina wire, surrounded the property. Singh approached a section of the fence, produced a pair of bolt cutters from the messenger bag she carried, and snipped through the heavy chain securing a service gate. The sound of the metal parting was loud in the night's silence. She slipped inside, closing the gate behind her. Tanaka parked his car a block away and approached on foot, keeping to the shadows. He found a spot across the street, behind a row of overgrown hedges, that gave him a clear view of the courthouse entrance. He pulled out a pair of compact binoculars. Singh had disappeared inside the main doors. He waited. An hour passed. Then another. The city grew quieter, the traffic dwindling to the occasional taxi or street sweeper. Just as he was considering his next move, whether to call it in, to go in after her, a light appeared inside the courthouse. It wasn't an electric light. It was a soft, violet glow, the same hue had seen in her eyes on the interrogation tape. It emanated from the main chamber on the 2nd floor, illuminating the tall, arched windows from within. He focused the binoculars on the central window. Through the grime and dust of the glass, he could see her. She was standing in the very center of the vast, empty courtroom, directly under the high, domed ceiling where the violet light was most concentrated. Her posture was ramrod straight, her head tilted slightly upward. She was perfectly, unnaturally still, like a statue. It wasn't the stillness of a person waiting, it was the stillness of a machine in standby mode, a receptacle waiting to be filled. She stood like that for what felt like an eternity, bathed in that otherworldly light. Tanaka watched, a cold dread seeping into him. She wasn't just standing there. She was communing. Reporting in. Receiving orders. She was a field agent for a jurisdiction that had no place on any map, and this derelict temple of human justice was her new precinct. Tanaka was operating outside of every protocol he had ever known. He couldn't go to his captain. What would he say? That his partner, the department's star officer, was communing with a violet light in an abandoned courthouse? They would have him in a psych evaluation before he finished the sentence. He was alone, armed with a handful of impossible observations and a growing certainty that he was catastrophically out of his depth. He needed context. He needed to know if this had ever happened before. There was only one person in the precinct who might have an answer. Alistair Finch was a departmental fossil, a civilian archivist who had been working in the records basement since before Tanaka was born. He was semi-retired, coming in only a few days a week to oversee the digitization of old files, a project that seemed destined to outlive Finch himself. He was a creature of paper and dust, a living repository of the precinct's institutional memory. More importantly, Finch was the gatekeeper of the unofficial archives. Tanaka found him in his subterranean kingdom, a cramped office surrounded by teetering stacks of file boxes and smelling of aging paper and weak tea. Finch, a man so thin he seemed to be held together by his tweed jacket, looked up from a brittle, yellow document, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose. "Officer Tanaka," Finch said, his voice a dry rustle. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Don't tell me you've developed a sudden passion for 1970s zoning disputes." "Alistair, I need your help," Tanaka said, getting straight to the point. He trusted Finch, but he was still a cop. He knew how to frame an inquiry without revealing his entire hand. "It's about a historical precedent. I'm looking for a specific type of case file. One that wouldn't be in the main system." Finch's eyes, magnified by his thick lenses, held Tanaka's for a long moment. He leaned back in his squeaking chair. "You mean a blue file?" It wasn't a question. The blue files were a precinct legend, a ghost story rookies told each other. They were supposedly the cases that were too strange, too disturbing, or too politically sensitive to be kept in the official records. Cases that were officially buried. Tanaka had always assumed they were a myth. "I'm looking for a case involving an officer," Tanaka began, choosing his words with care. "An officer who, after a specific incident, began exhibiting enhanced, or unusual, investigative abilities. Closing impossible cases. Gaining information through means that couldn't be explained by standard procedure." He watched Finch's face for a reaction. The old archivist showed none. He simply steepled his long, thin fingers. And did this officer's behavior also become detached? Did their application of the law become more absolute? Less concerned with spirit, more with a kind of mathematical precision? A cold shock went through Tanaka. Finch wasn't just listening, he was describing Singh's transformation with chilling accuracy. Finch knew. He had seen this pattern before. Tanaka just nodded. Finch gave a slow, weary sigh, the sound of a man confirming a long-held, unpleasant suspicion. He stood up, his joints creaking, and walked to a row of tall, gray filing cabinets in the far corner of the room. Unlike the others, these were locked with heavy, old-fashioned padlocks. He produced a key from his waistcoat pocket, unlocked one of the cabinets, and pulled open a drawer labeled simply Personnel. He ran a bony finger along the tabs of the densely packed files before pulling one out. It was a simple, pale blue folder, thick with documents and brittle with age. A layer of dust puffed from its surface as he placed it on the desk in front of Tanaka. The label on the tab was typed on an old manual typewriter. It read Detective Franklin Thorne. 1968. Detective Thorne was a rising star, Finch said softly, his gaze distant. Then, one night, he and his partner responded to a strange call at an observatory. An electrical surge, they called it. After that, well, he became the most effective detective this city had ever seen. For a while. He tapped the cover of the file. "Be careful what you're looking for, Officer Tanaka. Sometimes, finding the precedent is worse than not having one at all." Tanaka took the blue file not to his desk, but to one of the empty interrogation rooms. He needed a sterile environment, a place with no distractions, to digest what he was about to read. The file felt heavy in his hands, dense with the weight of a 50-year-old secret. The cover was stamped with the case number 734 and a codename Project Gemini. He opened it. The documents inside were a mix of official reports, typed memoranda on yellowing paper, and handwritten notes, all chronicling the career of Detective Franklin Thorne. The inciting incident was eerily familiar: a disturbance call at the Griffith Park Observatory. The report, filed by Thorne's partner, described a strange electrical surge and a pulsating auroral light that enveloped Thorne for a brief moment. The partner's follow-up statement, Tanaka noted, had been dismissed by his superiors as a symptom of shock. What followed was a mirror image of Singh's trajectory, warped through the lens of the late 1960s. Thorne began closing impossible cold cases. He'd walk into a room and know where a murder weapon was hidden. He could extract confessions without saying a word. Internal memos praised his uncanny intuition and his revolutionary investigative techniques. He was a departmental hero, a miracle worker. The file contained newspaper clippings with headlines lauding Detective Thorne as the city's greatest crime fighter. But as Tanaka read deeper into the file, the tone of the documents began to shift. The official commendations gave way to concerned, handwritten notes from Thorne's partner, then his captain. Thorne was becoming distant, cold. His solutions to crimes were always perfect, but his reasoning was becoming opaque, alien. He would submit evidence with no explanation of how he obtained it. He would name a killer, and he would always be right, but he could not or would not articulate the deductive process that led him to the conclusion. The file detailed Thorne's descent. He started dispensing his own brand of justice. A known mob enforcer, untouchable due to witness intimidation, was found dead in his home, a victim of what the coroner's report called a spontaneous cerebral hemorrhage, despite the man having been in perfect health. A corrupt politician was discovered in a catatonic state, babbling about seeing the numbers behind the world after a private conversation with Thorne. The detective was no longer solving crimes, he was erasing them, correcting imbalances with a terrifying, inhuman logic. He was no longer a cop, he was a force of nature wearing a badge. The last section of the file contained a series of heavily censored psychiatric evaluations. The doctors described a man who believed he had merged with an angel of order or a cosmic auditor. Thorne claimed he was now an agent of a higher, more perfect law, a law based not on evidence and testimony, but on a direct perception of guilt and innocence. The reports concluded that Detective Thorne was suffering from a messianic complex, a complete psychotic break from reality. But Tanaka, with the image of Singh standing in the violet light of the courthouse burned into his memory, knew it wasn't psychosis. Thorne had been telling the literal truth. The final page of the file was a single sheet of paper, a disposition report signed by the chief of police at the time. Most of the page was blank. It listed Thorne's name, shield number, and the date of his final report. Below that, under the heading Final Disposition, was a single, thick black bar of redaction ink. A word, or perhaps a phrase, had been completely obliterated. Beneath the black bar, the file was stamped in stark red letters closed. Permanently sealed. Tanaka stared at the redacted word, a chilling void on the page. He didn't need to see it to understand its meaning. He knew what happened when an asset became a liability that could never be exposed to the public. The department had fired Detective Thorne. They hadn't committed him to an institution. They had done what was necessary when faced with a compromised officer who knew too much and could do too much. They had redacted him. The knowledge from the blue file was a heavy, indigestible lump in Tanaka's gut. He could no longer stand by and observe. The precedent of Detective Thorne showed a clear, terrifying trajectory, and Singh was accelerating along the same path. He had to confront her. He had to know if any part of the woman he knew was still in there. He found her at the end of their next shift, not in the locker room, but on the roof of the precinct parking garage. A cold, steady rain was falling, slicking the concrete and blurring the city lights into a watercolor haze. She was standing at the edge, looking out over the sprawling metropolis, seemingly oblivious to the rain soaking her uniform. Tanaka approached her, the sound of his footsteps masked by the downpour. "I know what you are," he said, his voice flat and devoid of accusation. It was a simple statement of fact. She didn't turn around. To you, Kenji? Her voice was calm, a stark contrast to the storm around them. I'm not even sure I know. I know about the courthouse, he continued. I saw the interrogation tapes. The body cam footage. I even know this has happened before. Detective Franklin Thorne, 1968. At the mention of the name, she finally turned to face him. Rain plastered her dark hair to her forehead, but her expression was serene. There was no surprise, no anger, no fear. There was only a quiet, unnerving clarity in her eyes, the same eyes that now held a faint, barely perceptible violet luminescence in the gloom. The archivist, she stated, a flicker of something like mild interest in her tone. Of course. The system has redundancies. Patterns repeat. What system? Tanaka demanded, taking a step closer. What happened to you at the reservoir, Maya? What is this? An upgrade, she replied simply. The universe is a system of laws, Kenji. Physics, chemistry, causality. Human society is a subsystem, a chaotic and inefficient one. It generates imbalances. Crime, injustice, violence, these are errors in the code. Deviations from the mean. She took a step toward him, her movements fluid and precise. What I encountered at the reservoir was not an object. It was an auditor. A being of pure, dispassionate law. It saw my function, my desire for order, and it recognized a compatible vessel. We merged. It corrected my flaws, streamlined my processes, gave me access to the system on a fundamental level. Tanaka stared at her, the rain dripping from his chin. The woman who had been his partner was laying out a cosmic explanation for her behavior with the same detached tone she would use to describe a traffic accident. You're not a cop anymore, he said, the words feeling inadequate. You're something else. I am a more effective officer than Maya Singh ever was, she countered, her voice unwavering. I don't operate on hunches or flawed evidence. I see the imbalances directly. I know who is guilty. I am a perfect instrument of order. The law I swore to uphold is a crude approximation of the one I now serve, but the fundamental purpose is the same to correct what is wrong. She looked at him, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw a flicker of the old Maya, a trace of warmth in her gaze. You are a good officer, Kenji. You have a strong sense of duty. But you are limited by the human system. Due process, reasonable doubt, the presumption of innocence, these are protocols designed to compensate for flawed perception. I don't have flawed perception. I see the truth. Isn't that a better form of justice? The question hung in the air between them, more chilling than the rain. She was offering him a vision of a perfect, orderly world, enforced by a being that had shed the messy, inconvenient constraints of humanity. And the most terrifying part was that, for a split second, her cold, alien logic almost made sense. EOT. Singh's calm, logical argument for her own inhumanity left Tanaka deeply shaken. Her version of justice was a terrifying absolute, a mathematical certainty that bypassed every principle he had sworn to uphold. He needed to understand the effect of this justice, to see what it did to the people it was inflicted upon. He decided to pay a visit to Gerald Fleming, the handyman who had confessed to the Henderson murders. Fleming was not in the county jail awaiting trial. After his placid, detailed confession, he had suffered a complete psychotic breakdown. He was now a resident of the St. Jude Secure Psychiatric Facility, a bleak brick building on the outskirts of the city. Tanaka flashed his badge at the front desk, citing a need for a follow-up interview, a request that was met with a weary sigh from the supervising nurse. You can try, detective, she said, her voice heavy with resignation. But he's non-responsive. Has been since they brought him in. Total catatonia. He just sits and stares. She led Tanaka down a long, sterile corridor smelling of disinfectant and despair. Fleming was in the common room, sitting in a plastic chair, facing a blank wall. He was exactly as the nurse had described. His eyes were open but vacant, his body slack. He didn't react as Tanaka pulled up a chair beside him. Mr. Fleming? Gerald? Tanaka began, keeping his voice low and even. My name is Officer Tanaka. I was hoping to ask you a few more questions about your statement. There was no response. Fleming's gaze remained fixed on the beige paint of the wall. He didn't even seem to be breathing. Tanaka tried a different approach, mentioning details from the case, names of the victims, anything to elicit a reaction. Nothing. It was like talking to a mannequin. He was about to give up, convinced this was another dead end, when he decided to try one last thing. It was about Officer Singh, wasn't he it? He said, the words barely a whisper. The female officer who interviewed you. What did she do to you? For the first time, something flickered in Fleming's eyes. His head twitched, a tiny, spastic movement. His fingers, which had been resting limply in his lap, curled into tight fists. Tanaka leaned in closer, sensing a breach in the man's vacant facade. Gerald, what did she show you? Suddenly, Fleming moved with shocking speed. His hand shot out, grabbing Tanaka's wrist in a grip of surprising strength. His head snapped around, his eyes no longer empty but wide with a profound, soul-deep terror. His gaze was locked on Tanaka, but it felt like he was looking straight through him. She unspooled me, Fleming rasped, his voice a dry, cracking whisper, and used for weeks. Spittle flecked the corners of his mouth. She opened my head and she unwrote it. Showed me everything. Showed you what? Tanaka asked, his own heart starting to pound. The lines. The connections. Every choice, every action, every consequence, Fleming babbled, his grip tightening. It was all there, a map. A blueprint. The architecture of my sins. She made me see the shape of it. The weight of it. It's too much. The structure is too big. His eyes darted around the room, as if seeing things that weren't there. She's not a cop. She's a proofreader. She finds the typos in people and deletes them. Just as quickly as it had begun, the lucidity vanished. The terror in Fleming's eyes was replaced by the same blank emptiness as before. His hand went limp, releasing Tanaka's wrist. He turned his head back to the wall, his body resuming its motionless, catatonic posture. Two orderlies, alerted by the outburst, rushed into the room. Tanaka stood up, his own hand trembling slightly as he rubbed his wrist. He had his answer. Singh's justice wasn't about confession or repentance. It was about deconstruction. She didn't just show them their guilt, she forced them to comprehend the entirety of its structure, its place in the grand, causal schematic of the universe. She showed them the math of their own damnation. And for a human mind, that knowledge was a load-bearing wall it simply could not withstand. The protocol for requesting a private meeting with the deputy chief was labyrinthine by design, a bureaucratic firewall to keep the command staff insulated from the daily squabbles of the rank and file. But when Officer Tanaka cited an urgent matter of operational security regarding a compromised officer, and mentioned the name Thorne, the walls of procedure seemed to melt away. He was given a meeting time for the following morning. Deputy Chief Marcus Thorne's office was on the top floor of the headquarters building, a corner suite with a panoramic view of the city. It was a space of minimalist authority, a large steel and glass desk, 2 chairs for visitors, and a single, framed photograph on the credenza behind him. Tanaka's repertorial gaze registered it instantly, a black and white photo of a young detective in the style of the 1960s. Detective Franklin Thorne. Thorne sat behind his desk, his expression as neutral and polished as the mahogany surface. He gestured for Tanaka to sit. "You have my full attention, officer," he said, his voice a low, even baritone. He did not ask for pleasantries. Tanaka laid it all out. He spoke with the clipped, factual precision of an officer testifying in court, presenting his findings in chronological order. The incident at the reservoir. Singh's unnervingly perfect reports. Her impossible de-escalations and interrogations. The whispers in the evidence room. The violet light in her eyes on the videotape. The restored, inhuman silhouette from his body camera. His surveillance at the courthouse. The catatonic state of Gerald Fleming. And finally, he placed the blue file folder, which he had not returned to the archives, on the corner of Thorne's desk. Blue File 734, Tanaka finished. Project Gemini. Detective Franklin Thorne. It's the same pattern. Throughout the entire recitation, Thorne did not move. He did not interrupt, did not ask questions, did not betray a single flicker of surprise. He simply listened, his gaze fixed on Tanaka. When Tanaka was finished, a heavy silence filled the office. Thorne's eyes drifted to the blue folder, then back to Tanaka. "I know," Thorne said. The two words landed with the force of a physical blow, dismantling Tanaka's entire framework of assumptions. "I've been aware of Officer Singh's altered status since her clearance rate on cold cases began to defy statistical probability." Tanaka could only stare. "You know?" "Sir, She is what we classify as anomalous personnel," Thorne interrupted, his tone shifting into a kind of managerial lecture. Departmental Directive 1137, a protocol that exists well outside the standard regulations, was established to manage these rare but recurring events. "My father," he said, gesturing with his chin toward the photograph, "was the index case." He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly. "These entities, or contagions, or whatever they are, seem to be drawn to individuals with a profound, pre-existing affinity for order. Cops, mostly. When an officer is compromised, they are flagged. We observe. If their new abilities can be controlled, guided, they become an invaluable asset. Think of it, Tanaka. An investigator who cannot be lied to. A tactical officer who can calculate the precise application of force to resolve any conflict. Singh has been a high-value asset. She has closed more major cases in the last 6 months than our entire organized crime unit has in 3 years." Tanaka felt a rising sense of disbelief, of outrage. "An asset? Sir, what she did to Fleming, that isn't justice. It's psychic annihilation. She's not human anymore." "Her humanity is not the primary operational concern," Thorne stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Her adherence to departmental objectives is. My father eventually became a liability. His actions became erratic, personal, violent. He had to be decommissioned." The word was cold, sterile, the same sentiment as the black redaction bar in the file. Officer Singh, however, presents a different problem. She is not becoming violent. She is becoming autonomous. She is no longer following leads, she is pursuing her own mandate. A mandate dictated by the courthouse, or whatever it is she communicates with. Her actions are becoming unpredictable, and she is operating entirely outside our chain of command. That is why we are now forced into a re-evaluation of her status as an asset." He looked Tanaka directly in the eye, and for the first time, Tanaka understood the true, cold calculus of command. Thorne wasn't a conspirator, he was a manager of monsters, using a secret rulebook written a generation ago. And Tanaka hadn't exposed a threat, he had merely submitted a field report to the one person who already knew how to categorize it. The weeks following Tanaka's meeting with Deputy Chief Thorne were a strange, tense limbo. Tanaka was ordered to maintain his partnership with Singh, to continue his routine, and to report any further deviations directly to Thorne's office, bypassing the normal chain of command entirely. He was now an observer by official decree, a watchdog for a partner who was herself a walking, talking clandestine operation. The professional camaraderie was long dead, replaced by a silent, wary cohabitation within the claustrophobic confines of their patrol car. Singh, for her part, seemed utterly indifferent to the change, her focus still aimed at some distant horizon only she could see. The re-evaluation of Singh's status as an asset came sooner than Tanaka expected. The breaking point arrived not with a violent shootout or a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet, bloodless arrest that sent a shockwave through the city's political establishment. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Singh, without any prior notification or warrant request, had driven to City Hall. She had walked into the office of City Councilman Albert Kevington, a powerful and widely respected figure who was the chairman of the Finance Committee, and placed him under arrest. She escorted the baffled, sputtering councilman out of the building in handcuffs in front of a dozen reporters, an act of such audacious disregard for political reality that it bordered on the surreal. Back at the precinct, chaos erupted. The phones lit up with calls from the mayor's office, from the city's legal department, from Kevington's high-powered attorneys. Captain Rostova was apoplectic. Singh, however, was an island of calm in the storm. She placed the councilman in an interrogation room and began her booking paperwork with methodical detachment. Tanaka found her at her desk, calmly filling out the arrest report. "Maya, what are the charges?" he demanded, his voice low and urgent. "What did Kevington do?" Singh didn't look up from her paperwork. "Bribery. Conspiracy to defraud the city. Violation of the public trust. Where's the evidence? You can't just arrest a man like Kevington without an ironclad case." "The evidence is forthcoming," she said, her pen scratching across the form. She listed the details of a complex bid-rigging scheme involving a new municipal construction contract, a scheme that would have siphoned millions of dollars of public money into offshore accounts. The details were precise, intricate, and utterly convincing. There was only one problem. The construction contract she was referring to hadn't been awarded yet. The final bids weren't due for another 2 weeks. Tanaka felt a sudden, profound chill. "Maya," he said slowly, "this hasn't happened yet." For the first time, she stopped writing and looked up at him. Her eyes held that familiar, placid luminescence. "The crime is not the act, Kenji. It is the intent. The decision has been made. The causal chain has been initiated. The imbalance already exists. I am simply intervening at the most efficient point in the timeline." She had crossed a line. It was no longer about investigating crimes that had occurred, she was now policing intent. She was arresting people not for what they had done, but for what they were going to do. This was not law enforcement. This was pre-end of judgment, a concept so profoundly alien to the principles of justice that it made a mockery of the very badge she wore. The law Tanaka had sworn to uphold was built on the foundation of action and consequence, of due process for acts committed. Singh's new mandate operated in a realm of pure potentiality, a place where a guilty thought was as damning as a bloody knife. This was the deviation Thorne had been worried about. This was the autonomy that could not be controlled. An asset that could solve any crime was one thing. An asset that could redefine the very nature of crime itself was a liability of existential proportions. Singh was no longer just targeting murderers and thieves, she was now targeting the foundational principles of the legal system itself. And in doing so, she had finally, irrevocably, forced the department's hand. The political fallout from Councilman Kevington's arrest was immediate and catastrophic. He was released within hours, his lawyers screaming about civil rights violations, and the department was plunged into a public relations crisis of its own making. The official story was that Officer Singh had acted on a faulty tip and that she was being placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. It was a flimsy, transparent piece of damage control, but it was all they had. That evening, Tanaka received a one-line text from an unlisted number: "My office. 2,200 hours. Come alone." He knew who it was from. Deputy Chief Thorne's office was dark when he arrived, save for a single green-shaded lamp on his desk that cast long, deep shadows across the room. The panoramic view of the city was now a glittering tapestry of distant and different lights. Thorne was not sitting behind his desk. He stood by the window, his back to the door, a silhouette against the skyline. "She had to be publicly discredited," Thorne said, without turning around. "We had to frame her as unstable, overzealous. It's the only way to contain the damage from the Kevington situation and provide a plausible narrative for what comes next." "What comes next?" Tanaka asked, though he already knew. The cold, final logic of the situation had been settling in his mind since the arrest. Thorne turned from the window. His face, half lit by the desk lamp, was grim, etched with the weight of a decision he had clearly hoped he would never have to make. He walked to a tall, narrow safe built into the wall, a piece of furniture Tanaka hadn't noticed before. He spun a combination dial, the soft clicks echoing in the quiet office, and pulled the heavy door open. From within, he removed a black, hard-shelled case, about the size of a small briefcase. He placed it on the polished surface of his desk with a heavy, final-sounding thud. He did not open it. The Gemini protocol for my father was crude, Thorne said, his voice low. It involved his partner, a service revolver, and a story about a botched drug bust. We've had 50 years to develop a more specialized solution. For an unconventional problem, an unconventional tool is required. He gestured for Tanaka to approach the desk. Tanaka did, his eyes fixed on the case. It was made of a matte black, non-reflective material, with no markings for insignia of any kind. A low, sub-audible hum emanated from it, a vibration that seemed to travel up from the soles of Tanaka's feet. It was the same hum he had felt in the presence of the object at the Blackwood Reservoir. Why me? Tanaka asked, his voice tight. It was the only question that mattered. Because you were her partner. You are the only one who can get close to her without raising suspicion, Thorne said, his gaze unwavering. And because you are the only other officer who knows the truth. You understand the stakes. This isn't about punishing a rogue cop, it's about containing a biometaphysical threat. There is no one else I can trust to understand the distinction and to see the task through. He slid the case across the desk toward Tanaka. Directive 1137 is clear. When an anomalous asset becomes a liability, its operational status must be terminated. The entity within her is adaptive. It learns. We cannot risk it transferring to a new host or learning to operate without one. The solution must be absolute. Thorne's eyes were cold, the eyes of a man giving an order he knew was a death sentence. Officer Maya Singh is compromised beyond recovery. The verbal order is as follows: retire the asset. Create a plausible scenario, a confrontation with a suspect, an ambush, your choice. Make it clean. Make it believable. He paused, letting the full weight of the directive settle. And Officer Tanaka, he added, his voice dropping to a near whisper. There will be no report. This conversation never happened. This case does not exist. Do you understand? Tanaka looked down at the humming black case, then back at the man who had just ordered him to execute his partner. It was an unlawful order. It violated every regulation in the book, every principle of the law. But it was also, he knew with a sickening certainty, his duty. His oath was to protect the public, and the thing wearing Maya Singh's face was now a threat to the very foundation of the order he was sworn to defend. He placed his hand on the case. It felt cold to the touch. I understand, he said. The black case sat on the passenger seat of Tanaka's sedan, its low hum a constant, oppressive presence. He had driven to a secluded overlook, a place where he could think, but clarity refused to come. The city lights below were a cold, indifferent sprawl. He had opened the case once. Inside, nestled in high-density foam, was the weapon. It was not a firearm. It resembled a large, heavy-barreled pistol, but it was made of the same matte black material as the case, with no discernible trigger mechanism or ammunition port. Strange, faintly glowing geometric lines were etched into its surface, a design that echoed the impossible object from the reservoir. It felt cold and unnaturally heavy in his hand, a piece of alien engineering designed for a single, terrible purpose. He had a directive, an order from the highest level of command. His duty was clear. But the target was not just an asset. It was Maya. He remembered the rookie they had been, fresh out of the academy, both of them nervous and trying too hard. He remembered her covering for him when Head botched his first solo arrest. He remembered her laughing so hard at one of his jokes that Shed snorted her coffee, and the look of embarrassed surprise on her face afterward. These memories were ghosts now, specters of a person who no longer existed, but they still had weight. They were the anchors of his loyalty, and they were pulling him down. His duty to the badge and his loyalty to his partner were at war, a silent, brutal conflict waged in the confines of his own mind. To follow Thorne's order was to become an executioner, to commit a murder that would be officially sanctioned and then officially erased. To refuse was to let the entity wearing Singh's face continue its work, to allow its cold, inhuman version of justice to rewrite the very laws he had sworn to uphold. It was an impossible choice, a failure of duty no matter which path he took. But the image of Gerald Fleming's terrified, vacant eyes, and the memory of Singh's serene, logical defense of her own monstrosity, finally tipped the scales. The entity had to be stopped. The woman he knew was already gone. This was not an execution, it was a containment procedure. He picked up his phone. He had to set the stage, create the plausible scenario Thorne had demanded. He called her personal cell. She answered on the first ring. "Singh," she said, her voice flat and devoid of inflection. "Maya, it's me," Tanaka said, his own voice sounding foreign to his ears. "Listen, I need to talk to you. Off the record. Things are a mess after the Cavington arrest. I think I know a way to mitigate the damage, but it has to be face-to-face. No radios, no witnesses." There was a pause. He could almost feel her analyzing his words, searching for the intent behind them, the shape of the causal chain he was initiating. "Specify the location," she said finally. "Blackwood Reservoir," he said, the words tasting like poison. "The pumping station. Where it all started. It feels appropriate." 1 hour. "Affirmative," she said, and the line went dead. He drove to the reservoir, the gravel of the access road crunching under his tires, the same sound as that first, fateful night. The concrete monolith of the pumping station loomed against the starless, overcast sky. He parked his car out of sight and walked the rest of the way, the black case heavy in his hand. He entered the lower level, the vast, cavernous chamber where they had found the object. The air was still thick with the smell of decay and rust. He didn't turn on his flashlight. He didn't need it. A faint, ambient, violet light was already beginning to seep into the room, emanating from the spot where the object had hovered. She was already here, or she was coming. He took up a position behind one of the massive, defunct turbines, the cold, pitted steel pressing against his back. He opened the case and took out the weapon. He didn't know how it worked, only that it did. He held it in a two-handed grip, the way he had been trained with his service pistol, but the unfamiliar weight and balance felt alien in his hands. He was torn. His mind was a maelstrom of conflicting loyalties and a deep, aching grief for the partner he had already lost. He was a cop, not a hitman. But his target was no longer a cop. His duty was to protect the public from the threats she now represented. He steadied his breathing, the litany of the academy running through his head: control your breathing, control your weapon, control the situation. The violet light in the center of the room grew brighter. He heard the soft crunch of footsteps on the grated metal floor. She was here. The silence in Conference Room 3B had become a physical presence, as dense and heavy as the mahogany table. Officer Kenji Tanaka pushed a single, neatly typed document across the polished surface toward Deputy Chief Thorne. The document's header was stark and official. Incident Report 77B91. Homicide of a peace officer. That, Tanaka said, his voice a low, gravelly monotone, is the official record. It is the story that will be released to the press. It is the narrative that will be read at the inquest and entered into the permanent city archive. It is the account that justifies the inscription of Officer Maya Singh's name on the memorial wall in the lobby. He did not need to read it aloud. He knew every word by heart. He had written it, rewritten it, and bled every drop of truth from its sterile, procedural language until only the necessary lie remained. Incident Narrative Summary. At approximately 2,300 hours, reporting officer R.O. Tanaka met with Officer Maya Singh at the decommissioned Blackwood Reservoir pumping station. The meeting was arranged to discuss a sensitive, off-the-record lead Officer Singh was pursuing related to the recent, high-profile Cavington case. Per Officer Singh's request, the meeting was conducted without radio communication to ensure confidentiality. Upon R.O. Tanaka's arrival, Officer Singh was already on scene and appeared to be engaged in a verbal confrontation with an unidentified male suspect in the lower-level pump room. The suspect was described as male, approximately 6 feet tall, wearing dark clothing. Due to poor lighting conditions, no further details could be ascertained. As R.O. Tanaka entered the chamber and announced his presence, the suspect produced an unknown type of firearm. An exchange of gunfire ensued. R.O. Tanaka took cover behind machinery. Officer Singh discharged her service weapon in an attempt to neutralize the threat. The suspect fired a single shot. The sound and muzzle flash of the suspect's weapon were anomalous, described by R.O. Tanaka as a low-frequency hum and a flash of violet light. Officer Singh was struck and fell immediately. The suspect fled the scene through a rear maintenance tunnel before R.O. Tanaka could acquire a clear target. R.O. Tanaka immediately rendered aid to Officer Singh, but her injuries were fatal. She was pronounced deceased at the scene. A search of the area for the suspect yielded negative results. One spent casing from Officer Singh's weapon was recovered. Forensic analysis of the scene revealed trace energy signatures of an unknown type near Officer Singh's body, consistent with an experimental or non-regulation weapon. The investigation remains open. Tanaka looked up from the report on the table and met the eyes of the three people who would decide his fate. Captain Rostova's face was pale, her expression a mixture of horror and a dawning, terrible understanding. The Union rep, Miller, looked utterly lost, as if the foundations of his world had been shaken loose. Deputy Chief Thorne's expression, however, remained unchanged, a mask of cold, managerial neutrality. He had read this script before, in a different file, 50 years ago. "That report is a lie," Tanaka said, his voice dropping, the formal tone of the briefing replaced by the weary finality of a confession. There was no suspect. There was no exchange of gunfire. Officer Singh did not die protecting the city from a criminal. He let his hands rest on the table, no longer trying to still their tremor. She died because she had become a threat to the very definition of law this department is sworn to uphold. She was compromised by an entity that operates on a logic we cannot comprehend, a logic of absolute, preemptive order. A logic that has no place for due process, or mercy, or humanity. He looked directly at Thorne. "I carried out your directive. I met her at the place where she was lost, and I retired the asset." The official term felt obscene on his tongue. "The weapon you provided it did not fire a bullet. When activated, it discharged a wave of energy that did not harm Officer Singh's body. It unmade the thing that was inside her. It dissolved the geometric light, the connection to the auditor. And without it, there was nothing left of her. The woman I knew was already gone. Her body simply stopped. The hum of the digital recorder was the only sound in the room." Tanaka had laid the entire, impossible truth at their feet. The official lie on the table, and the unbearable reality behind it. He had followed his orders. He had broken his oath to save it. He had killed his partner to protect his city. "My supplementary, off-the-record statement is concluded," he said, his voice finally breaking with an exhaustion that was bone-deep. He stood up, his chair scraping softly against the floor. "The cost of this duty is high. I have paid it. Now you must decide what to do with the truth." He did not wait for a response. He turned and walked out of the conference room, leaving the three of them in the chilled, silent air, with the lie on the table and the truth hanging between them, a ghost in the machine. And so, the official report is filed, and the lie becomes history, etched in stone on a memorial wall. We are left with the silent, heavy truth of a choice made in the dark, where duty to the badge meant betraying a partner. The story asks what happens when the only way to uphold the law is to commit an act that breaks you, leaving a truth that can never be entered into the official record. This is the kind of story we live to unseal here at Keeper of the Dark Logs, one that forces us to navigate the gray spaces between right and wrong. It leaves us with so many questions, but I want to put one directly to you. Faced with the same impossible order from Deputy Chief Thorne, and knowing everything he knew, what would you have done? Thank you for joining us in the archives, and until next time, stay vigilant. After all, the file on Detective Thorne was only one of many dust-covered secrets in the Archivist S collection.